Welcome to You Are Here, Building Believable Spaces in VR. Please welcome your speaker, Kimberly Voll.
Thank you very much. If I'd realized my title was going to be said so loudly, I might have thought a little bit more about it. It sounds so much more impressive at volume. So I'm going to kind of dial the story up a little, I guess you could say, insofar as I'm going to step back from some of the neuronal stuff that was just referred to and talk about it from more of a cognitive science lens. So my name's Kim. I am a cognitive scientist, as you might have guessed. I work as a research scientist and a technical designer. I have spent many, many years working in and around player psychology and the psychology of interactive experiences. I have a PhD in artificial intelligence, so I'm also a programmer by trade as well. And I was a designer, researcher, and programmer on the Fantastic Contraption team. So I have worked in VR, I have shipped titles in VR. I've also been a game designer and have shipped several other indie titles. By day, I actually work for Riot Games, though I don't do anything in VR there, so I'm not going to talk about that here. If you're not familiar with Fantastic Contraption, it is a physics-based puzzler where you don the rig and you have a simple set of construction tools with which to work, and you are trying to build fantastic contraptions that will carry a goal object from wherever it spawns in the world to the goal destination in that world. So what I'm really here to talk about today is presence. Who here's heard the word presence before? Yeah, who here's sick of hearing the word presence? Yeah, no sicker than me. So I think a lot about how brains perceive experiences, and really the question of what does it mean to be here? And where is here and what is here? I mean, that's a really interesting and complex question just in and of itself. But being somewhere, without going down to the nitty-gritty details that have been discussed already, is really a convergent sensory experience. It's this huge perceptual collection of things that are fed into our brain at any given moment that serve up reality. And our world is fundamentally malleable. There are all sorts of different things that are affecting our perception of that world at any given moment. Now, why does this matter from VR? Well, it's the question of how we go from something like this. This is the sword of Damocles from way back in, I think it was the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. So we go from something like this, or this is actually a rigid, old school model, but to something like this, or wherever it is that you want to go. Now, in order to be able to do this, we need to recognize a couple high-level things about the brain. We've heard a lot of really interesting, detailed things about the hippocampus and the role that it plays in mapping and memory formation and understanding things about the world. The brain is a pretty amazing thing, but we can't trust our brains. Our brains are always screwing with us. What we perceive as reality is really whatever our brains decide to serve up to us as reality. So we can't necessarily trust everything that we see, and while this is a fairly short talk, I can't go into detail. There are plenty of examples from optical illusions to all sorts of other things that our brains fall prey to all the time. Our brains really, really hate inconsistency, and so we'll do things even like rearranging memories, unconscious to us, in order to perceive some form of consistent world. And that may not be reality, but it's the reality that you're presented. So fundamentally, we can't necessarily trust the things that we think are real. But that's great for us as developers within the VR world, because this means that the brain is gullible. We can work with this if we understand a little bit more about it. So to go back to the question, what does it mean to be here, this convergent sensory experience? Well, it's really a perceptual soup, right? There's a whole series of different signals that are coming in at any given moment, and the signal-to-noise ratio is shifting back and forth, and there are certain things that will bubble up to precedence at any given moment that are relevant. Now, I'm just going to go through a really high-level overview of what some of these things are, but the reality is we don't actually know what all of them are. So some of them are, of course, visual cues, right? These are things that, of course, we've learned are also manipulable. Now, some people think that in order for us to feel present in a space, we have to have highly photorealistic content, but that is not true. We can feel present in a space even with things that look kind of cartoony or are lower fidelity, and I'll talk about the implications of that in a little bit. There's also, of course, audio cues. Does the audio match the surroundings? Are you being presented with an environment that is in close quarters, where you would anticipate, or rather your brain would, perhaps not consciously, those audio cues to sound like you are in close quarters? But if you're in a big open space, that becomes a contradiction. So these are the sorts of things that we have to be mindful of when we are creating these experiences. And at certain given moments, some things will become more important than others. There's also, of course, proprioception. And this is the system really throughout your entire body of nerves and systems that basically give you the information about where you are in the world in terms of the orientation of your body and various pieces. So if you were to close your eyes right now and imagine you were anywhere else other than here, chances are you're probably not going to be able to do it, at least not so much that airlines are going to go out of business. And that's because your butts are really loud. Your butts are talking to your brain right now as you sit in these seats. They are sending you signals that say, hey, yeah, I'm actually in this chair. There's audio cues, there's air cues, there's all of these different things that are coming in that are telling your brain right now that, no, you're actually still here. So the proprioception system is all of that orientation stuff that's coming in. And then, of course, there's the actual vestibular system. So this is the stuff that's monitoring things like accelerations, how fast your head is rotating, how it's translating through space, its orientation at space, etc. It's not exactly conscious. You don't get some sort of heads-up display that says where you are in the world with respect to the vestibular organs. But it's never turned off. And so if you mess with it or you don't present things that are consistent, then you start to feel a little bit off, and worse, you can actually become nauseated. Now, some of the other interesting things about our world and how we perceive it come in the form of extension. So we have these, most of us, and we are able to extend into the world through our hands. We reach out, we connect with our world, we touch things, we grab things. We don't live just in here, we live out here. And when we're not able to realize that expectation of how we move about the world, it can interfere with our perception of actually feeling like we're there. So presence, in part, requires some way to extend into the world and to be able to meet those expectations for how you move around. And so while you can get high degrees of presence, and there's lots of other cues. Like I said, it's a perceptual soup with mobile, for example, without hands displays. So far, the best examples of presence we have out there do require you to have hands, at least in some form. And then we can get into interesting things like co-presence. What does it mean to be somewhere with someone else? We're all in this room together, right? Unless you're a solipsist and think we're all figments of our imaginations, but we are all sharing this space together. And so when you're creating a believable experience, one way you can contribute to that is by having other people in that space. Because our brains like to see that there are other things that they're used to seeing in that space. So you can have shared conversations and a shared reality. And if I gesticulate towards something and you look in the direction to which I'm gesticulating, that adds a certain level of believability to that space. But if you're all watching me on a flat screen or et cetera, where there's not that shared connection where how I'm moving about the world is influencing you as members of this world, then that can detract the believability of the world as well. So one of the things I like to talk about is something called the fidelity contract. And this is really the sum total of all of the things, all of the affordances of the world that come together to set the expectations, either consciously or unconsciously, of the person in that artificial world. And when we violate those things, when we set up an expectation of being able to do something that is not actually upheld by that experience itself, you violate the fidelity contract and you lose a certain degree of believability, sometimes catastrophically. So here's an example of a world that is fairly high visual fidelity, but it has a high level of interactivity, and it's the little things that really do count in this case. So here you can see the anemones, and you're able to reach in with your hand, and they close, and they respond to you in a believable way. And even your head, if you lean your head in, the anemone will still close. And so the things that you would expect to be able to interact with the world, the things that you would expect to see a causal connection in the world, those things are there and present. It's not perfect, though, so there are cases when you can see fish, for example, swim through each other, which of course your brain knows through being in a world and being human and navigating this natural world is not actually going to happen. So there are things that do deteriorate this experience. On a more cartoony scale, of course, there's Job Simulator. Job Simulator is a really great example of modeling a number of different things that, at the end of the day, you put in front of the player and they're just going to want to touch. They're going to want to interact with them. It's how we naturally move about the world. And so they've done a really good job of creating those opportunities to interact. Pardon me. There we go. So a coffee maker, you have a big candy-like button on it. You can push the big candy-like button. You have objects that you can grab, physics that is being fulfilled in a meaningful way. So it's not interrupting the player's perception of that experience. But if a player tries to do something and it doesn't fit that model, again, that's where you get into trouble. So as I said, there's these shifting weights, this shifting noise, all of this stuff moving around the world in a meaningful way that is contributing to what it feels like to be somewhere. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the priorities of what you're facing off against at any given time will also affect what bubbles up. And I'll talk about that in a moment too. So how do we get there? Well, there's different ways. Presence is, of course, a powerful force. I mean, you can do all sorts of things from treating phobias to just being able to take people to places. It's not necessarily required that you have high presence in your experiences, and sometimes you actually want to experiment with holding on to differing degrees of reality. In virtual reality, this could be because there's an audience kind of participating and yelling suggestions at you, as they do with our game, Fantastic Contraption. Or this could be in the case of augmented reality, where you're looking to have that strong cohesion with the world that's being presented, from the artificial with the actual. So one way in which we can get easy presence is actually engagement. So if you run at me as a zombie in a space where I don't think I can get away, I'm going to pay attention to that. It's no different than if a tiger were to jump up on stage. No offense, I'm going to pay a heck of a lot more attention to that than anything else going on here. So all of those other things that could otherwise interfere with my sense of presence within that world, that's the most important thing to me. Similarly, in a game called Budget Cuts, you're sneaking around and you're trying to avoid these robots in the world, and you can pick up knives and you can throw them there. And this world is really interesting because it actually creates a sense of being in this facility and actually having to crawl around these walls and duck behind them when the robot looks at you, despite the fact you could just stick your head through it at any given moment. I mean, it's obviously not real. And it's also an interesting use of space because even though there is the suggestion of a larger facility, I mean, there's big doors there, I don't care about it because I'm far more concerned about that robot. So the things that you pay attention to at any given moment, the things that you are drawing your players' attention to, those are the things that help define the quality of that experience and set those expectations or that fidelity contract. Audio Shield is an example of a fairly simple kind of world. So it's set to music, whichever music you want to play. You've got two shields in your hands, and you're just basically reflecting these things that are coming at you. It's a very simple world, but it's very visceral. It's driven by the cadence of the music, and it's very obvious what you have to do in that moment. So you're paying attention to all the right things with minimal distractions. In the archery demo in the lab, again, you're not necessarily in a full fight or flight response here, but you're certainly concentrating on what it is that you're doing. You know, these little guys are approaching you, and you're trying to be able to attack them before they get to the little castle door, etc. So really pulls your attention because you have a task, and this is where you get back into things like traditional game design, where you're looking to establish flow, etc. In a subsequent blue demo, it's a little dark, I apologize. The screen's a little well lit. But you're underwater again. This time you've got a flashlight, and you've got all sorts of interesting little particulate, as you might imagine, being deep under the sea. If you've ever been there, I haven't, but it seems legit. And even though you can't really see it here very well, you're looking around with the flashlight. There's actually a kind of a creepy audio track that's playing as well. That's tapping into our very deeply Hollywood conditioned anticipation of, uh-oh, something's going to go down. This is scary. And it has you paying attention and focusing in the world in a very particular way. So if there are other artifacts, if there were certain things that maybe weren't rendered as clearly, if it wasn't as photorealistic, those things would be less impactful in the believability of the space because these other cues are sending louder signals. How do you create co-presence? Well, you just put people in the space with you. And that's, of course, been an incredibly hard challenge up until fairly recently, but we're seeing lots of interesting steps in that direction. So the Foo Show is something that I think is doing really interesting work, where they're doing interviews with game developers in the context of VR. So you can drop into the VR world with them, you can observe, you can look around, you can watch what's going on, you can, of course, enjoy the interview itself. And at certain points, they will take the game itself and let you drop into it as well. So this is a game made by some friends of mine called Firewatch, and you can actually, you're in a fire tower and exploring land. It's wonderful. You should totally check it out. It's beautiful narrative. But in this particular case, you're in the Firewatch tower, and you can drop in there with the interviewers. You can continue to listen to the interview. You can pick up artifacts in the world, and you can kind of interact within that space. So it's very, very early days in understanding what it means to share a space virtually and actually extend into a space. And there's lots of things you have to worry about, including violating a person's space. Even if you have just a head in a virtual reality space, reaching through where your body would be is very uncomfortable to most people. So while we extend into the world and we're used to having visual cues of where our hands in the world are, at least in and out at various moments, we don't necessarily stare at our bodies while we're walking around, but we still have a very strong sense of them being there. So even if things aren't rendered, things that interfere with that are problematic. And while they may not explicitly affect the believability of the space, they certainly will affect the comfort of that space. And then, of course, most importantly, you don't want to violate this fidelity contract, these expectations that you have set in your world. And it's really, really hard to figure out what people are going to do in that space, because you effectively have to jump in their heads and guess at what's happening. So how do you do that? Well, you watch people in your space. You pay attention to what they're doing, because humans will do what humans do when they're presented with a space. Assuming that somebody isn't so new to VR, which isn't necessarily an easy thing to say, at least where we are today, but assuming that somebody isn't so new to VR that they are just simply taken aback by the wonder of the experience itself, they will move through that world, they will explore, and they will do things. And you will be surprised by the things that catch their attention and the things that they try to interact with. And that's what's important, because it's those touches, it's filling in those gaps that really do craft a believable experience. If I can reach up to a chest of drawers and pull open a drawer, that's a very different experience than if I can see a well-rendered chest of drawers and perhaps cupboards and other things that I can open and close. And when I reach towards that, it's not modeled, so I can't open it. That kind of breaking of expectation rips people out of an experience. And as I say, it can be catastrophic. It can completely undermine a sense of presence and believability in that space. So some of the things that we learned within our game included interacting with some of the elements. And so we have a cat that is actually our menu, or pardon me, it's the toolbox. So this is where you can get your tools to build your contraptions. And it was a cat, people kept petting the cat. And so we knew we had to do something to be able to model that, so that even though players, there's kind of two categories. There's things that you can do that a player will never notice, and you will never get credit for that. And that's okay, because if they did notice it, it would feel shitty and the experience would be broken. And then there's the category of things that you do and people do notice, and they're like, holy cow, oh my God, I pet the cat, that was incredible, this is the best game ever. Because they're not expecting that. And so it really turns into building trust with the person, with the participant within your experience. Because they're gonna come from a range of either, VR is bullshit, I'm never gonna believe any of this, to, I'm totally susceptible to this and I'm already bought in. And you never know where on that spectrum they're going to fall. And anything you do from start to finish could be disrupting the believability of that environment. And Cosmic Trip, which is a new game coming up, I believe it's in early access right now. They're around on the floor. It's a great little game, you should be watching it. They've got some amazing little touches here, including, again, creatures you can interact with. Like, how do you not love that, right? That's just fantastic. Their UI is very responsive as well. You're moving out the world. It feels like it should feel when you're in that space. Super important. But what can interfere with this? I mean, I've talked about violating the fidelity contract, violating those expectations, but there's other things that interfere as well with the believability of a space, with feeling like you're there. So I talk about the reality tether as being that way in which your head holds a representation of the outside world, the non-VR world, while you're in VR. And that can be very dangerous, because if you, for example, maybe you set up room scale in and around your very sharp, shin-hungry coffee table, and you throw on the rig and now you're sneaking around there, you're pretty conscious that that table's somewhere around there, because you maybe forgot once or twice and then you never forgot again. So adding that cognitive load of having to hold that representation at whatever degree of consciousness is interfering with your brain's ability to believe in the current space that it's in. So we have to be mindful of that. Having a cord, having all of these things that are just, what we have to roll with right now, where we are with the current technology, it does impact what we're doing. You need to have players, you need to have participants that can believe and trust in the experience that you are giving them. So real obstacles, I mentioned that already. And something else that we were seeing that we didn't really know till I've been working with VR actually even before the original DK1, but certainly not with an affordable rig that I could be testing on extensively. And one of the things that I didn't think would ever happen, because I grew up in the 70s and 80s when VR was the coolest thing in the whole world and it was all I ever wanted, I didn't ever think that exposure would actually start desensitizing me to the wonder of it. But it has. When I first tried some of the high-end rigs a couple years ago, everything was different. The world changed for me. And while that world hasn't unchanged, when I put the rig on now, I certainly don't feel the high sense of presence I did in those early days. And that's because the visual stuff no longer sells the experience for me. There are all that whole soup that I was telling you about. All of those other signals now for me are much, much louder because the wow factor has worn off. So it really gets you down to the core of the experience itself, and it means that we as developers have to make sure that when that wow factor wears off, there's still an experience underneath. But for those of you creating content in this space, be very mindful. We are basically in a world of VR virgins, and if we are relying on everyone's wow factor to calibrate the quality of the experiences that we have to generate, we are going to fall so short. So we need to be able to create checks and balances and opportunities to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And then, of course, there's the white coat effect, where it just doesn't necessarily feel super cool to know that you're being watched by people. There are many people, you go to the show floor and you're the one standing up there doing goofy things that just aren't cool with that, and so don't want to try these experiences. And I've had things where people will actually hold an expectation of the world in their head, where they come in and they're like, I'm not going to give in, I'm not going to give in. It's like when I was a teenager and I used to watch horror movies and I didn't want to be scared in front of my friends, so I would do everything. I'd think about any boring possible thing I could think of, like spending the day at the bank with my parents, just so I wouldn't get pulled into that movie and get startled. So just to kind of sum up, being somewhere is the product of many inputs. So we have to be mindful of what those inputs are, and we don't know what they all are, but we need to think about them in the context of our experience. Believable spaces require anticipating player focus and creating engagement, so thinking about where you're drawing their attention and doing lots of testing to make sure that you are actually upholding the fidelity in the spaces that your player is trying to go, in the experiences that you're creating. And of course, not violating those expectations, so upholding the fidelity contract. Now, I know we're going to roll into questions, so I've kept this super high level, and we can talk about this more, but that's all I've got for you, so thank you.